Belgian officials made several arrests Friday in connection with the recent attacks in Brussels. Among those arrested is Mohamed Abrini. Police detained him during a raid in Belgium Friday. Abrini is believed to have helped carry out the attacks in Paris last year. For analysis of the arrest in Belgium, I'm joined by CBS national security analyst Juan Zarate, who is on the phone with us. Juan, what is your reaction to the raids carried out in Belgium Friday?
Well, Elaine, this is good and helpful news for the Belgian authorities as well as the French authorities, who've been worried about this individual and certainly have wanted to capture him in order to understand better not only his role, but what he knows about other operatives who form part of this Francophone network that has proven so deadly in both Paris and Brussels. And so authorities are going to be focused very, very intently on trying to understand what this individual knows, with whom he's been communicating, certainly trying to exploit as much information about him and from him as possible. And so this is good news because he's a major character who is obviously dangerous. He's no longer a risk to the public, and he's certainly a font of great information potentially for authorities.
You know, when we were talking to our Charlie D'Agata earlier, he mentioned that it's quite possible Abrini traveled to Syria and that his brother is actually known to have traveled back to Syria. Obviously, this is still very early in the process, Juan, but what would that suggest, if anything, to you?
Well, it suggests a couple things, Elaine. One is that, as we know, there is more fluidity in the travel between Syria and Europe than previously thought. What we've discovered with the emergence of these networks, the fact that you've had family members involved, the fact that the major leaders of these networks have traveled back and forth rather freely, is suggestive of a very fluid network that continues to operate between Europe and Syria, and one that doesn't see a real divide between Syria and Europe. This is all sort of one environment for them. Secondly, the fact that these groups continue to leverage existing and known networks of operatives, be they family members or previously known social or even criminal networks that have formed part of these cells. We've seen this in European case after European case, the reality that these are networks that may have been known to authorities before, may have been expanded over time, but are a fairly cohesive set of actors that has been reinforced in Syria and that ISIS has then leveraged to send back into attack. And so all of this new information, especially the good reporting that Charlie's given us, reinforces some of those impressions and certainly will raise concerns still that you have more operatives out there that may be trying to get to Europe from Syria if they're not already in Europe.
Juan, I know you and I talked last month after the arrest of Abdeslam, and we discussed the fact that there had been, it's an interesting development that there had been this person, Salah Abdeslam, living in this neighborhood, essentially right under the noses of Belgian authorities. I'm wondering, what is your sense of the interview process now that's going to be carried out with Abrini, this latest arrest? What do you think will take place as far as extracting intelligence, usable intelligence, getting that information that you talked about at the top, as well as possibly identifying other suspects?
Well, Elaine, it's a great question because I think in Belgium there's been some soul searching as to whether or not the questioning of Abdeslam after his capture the Friday before the Brussels bombings was vigorous enough, whether or not it entailed enough questions in detail around future plots as well as other networks, and whether or not, frankly, they took enough time with him to ask him questions. Part of that had to do, of course, with the fact that he was wounded. But your question is important because there has been a lot of political and internal discussion in Belgium as to what information should be gathered from these kinds of individuals. So they're obviously going to be as aggressive as they can be in terms of the scope of questions that they're asking. They're going to try to get as much information about current and future threats potentially, so information about potential plots, anything that he's known or heard about that could be a potential plot with respect to target set, with respect to individuals involved, with respect to methodology. They'll want to know about any weapons or explosives that may be out there, either factories or experts or materiel. They'll want to understand all the contours of his communications and network. And so no doubt if he had a cell phone on him or a smartphone, Belgian authorities are probably not going to be shy about trying to access as much information as possible to understand who he's been in contact with, especially since he's been back in Europe and especially since the attacks in both Paris and Brussels. And so they're going to do everything possible to deepen their knowledge, to discover new knowledge around these networks. And Elaine, as you and I have discussed over time, the Europeans have realized in arrest after arrest that they still don't have their arms around all of the elements of this network, which is not only a scary proposition, but adds enormous urgency and pressure to the counterterrorism work of these officials. So this interrogation and all of the information exploitation around this arrest will be critical to adding more detail and discovery to what the Europeans know about the threat.
Yeah, still a lot of unanswered questions. All right, Juan Zarate, thank you so much for your analysis.
My pleasure, Elaine. Thank you.
In the next installment of CBSN Originals, we revisit Brussels after the terror attack. Our own Vladimir Duce visited Brussels, finding a city filled with sorrow and anger. Join us Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern for the full episode of CBSN Originals, Terror in Brussels, Hiding in Plain Sight.